At Sunday dinner, my uncle turned to me and said, "You still don't have a real job, right?" Everyone laughed as my mom patted his shoulder and said, "He's just not like his cousins." I didn't argue one, just pulled out my phone, opened the banking app they all forgot I controlled, and froze the family trust. 2 minutes later, the room fell silent as my aunt whispered, "Wait, why isn't my card working?" Welcome to Cheat Sheet Tales, where loyalty dies, lies bleed out, and the truth hits like a slap to the face. These aren't just stories. They're confessions soaked in betrayal and regret. Ever spotted a red flag when it was already too late? Say it in the comments. Let's tear into today's tale. I'm 29 years old, and to most of my extended family, I'm the weird one. The one who doesn't work a real job, who lives in his laptop, and who probably still sleeps in until noon. My name is Adrian, and for the last 4 years, I've been running a fairly successful fintech startup. It's a kind of success you don't brag about because you'd rather avoid the questions, the assumptions, and worst of all, the resentment and trust. Me, there's plenty of that in my family. It all came to a boiling point at Sunday dinner last week. Our monthly family gathering, more like a parade of backhanded compliments for smiles, and everyone pretending to tolerate each other long enough to get through dessert without flipping a table. We were at my Aunt Linda's house this time. Her sprawling, overly decorated mansion always felt like a showroom pretending to be warm and inviting. The long dining table was set up with enough food to feed a small army, every seat filled. Uncles, aunts, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood, all there and all ready for their favorite pastime. Subtle humiliation. I'd barely set my drink down when my Uncle Ron leaned over from across the table, flashing his usual smug grin. "So Nate," he started loud enough for everyone to hear, "you still don't have a real job, right?" Some of the older cousins chuckled. My mom, who sat next to him, laughed softly and patted his shoulder. "He's just not like his cousins, Ron. He always wanted to do his own thing." Translation: we don't know what he does, so we've decided it doesn't count. I felt the familiar wave of heat rush up the back of my neck. I didn't answer. I didn't defend myself. Just smiled tightly and took a sip of water because what was the point? Any attempt to explain myself would only lead to more patronizing questions. What exactly do you do again? Is that sustainable? Isn't it risky? Why don't you just get a job with benefits like everyone else? No one asked how I was doing.
No one
cared that my startup had just crossed its first million in revenue this quarter, or that I had just closed a deal that frankly would set me up comfortably for years. But the real kicker, they forgot who was managing the family trust. It started 2 years ago, when my grandfather passed. He'd built his wealth slowly and carefully, investing in property and businesses for decades. He'd trusted me with managing the family trust because I was the numbers guy. Even back then, when everyone dismissed me as some eccentric computer nerd, Grandpa saw something in me. He called it an instinct for strategy. When he asked me to take care of the family trust, I didn't hesitate. Promised him I'd keep it safe, and I have. Of course, nobody remembered that part. I just enjoyed the payouts, quiet monthly transfers, college tuition, the new kitchen remodel Aunt Linda just completed, all tied to the trust, all rooted through the very banking infrastructure I'd built to manage it. They never questioned it. They never asked. They just assumed it would always be there like air. So that night, when Uncle Ron made his little joke and the laughter rippled around the table, something in me clicked. It wasn't anger, not really. It was clarity. I pulled out my phone slowly. No one noticed at first. They were too busy fawning over my cousin Trevor, who'd just been hired at some corporate accounting firm that required a suit and tie and zero creativity. My thumb moved deliberately over the screen into the banking app, into the management portal. I designed myself, a few taps, a biometric check, and then a single toggle. Trust distribution. Paused. That was it. No drama, no announcements. Just a quiet flip of a digital switch. I set my phone down beside my plate and resumed eating. Only took 2 minutes. Aunt Linda's husband, Greg, was the first to notice. He frowned at his phone, tapped it a few times. then leaned over and whispered something to her. She looked confused, then alarmed. She tapped at her own phone, then looked up, her face pale. "My card's not working," she whispered. "What?" "It says the count issue." A hush began to settle. My cousin Jenna's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. Why did my tuition payment fail?" Uncle Ron's laughter died in his throat. Then came the sound of clinking forks stopping midair, followed by the low, awkward murmur of confusion spreading around the table like a virus. I kept eating. My mom looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time all evening. Her expression shifted, unsure, calculating. "Adrian," she said slowly, her voice the only sound cutting through the growing silence. "Did something happen?" I met her gaze, calm, still, no anger, just stillness. "I guess I'm just not like my cousins," I said softly. Then I took another bite of roasted potatoes and waited. Because this was just the beginning, the silence. That was the moment they realized something had changed. That maybe, just maybe, the person they thought was a doormat in hoodies and headphones had been holding the keys to the castle this entire time, and I wasn't done yet. The silence hung like fog in the room, thick, awkward, and impossible to ignore for a moment. It was like everyone had forgotten how to speak. Even the clink of silverware had stopped. Just 20 seconds earlier, my family was riding high on their usual condescension, laughing at my expense. Now, one by one, they were sinking into a shared realization. Something was wrong, and they all had the same sinking feeling about who was behind it. Uncle Ron, who for the record hadn't paid for a single vacation in 2 years, thanks to the trust, leaned forward, resting his pudgy elbows on the table. He gave me that same smug grin, though now it looked more strained than confident.
"All right."
"Nate," he chuckled too loudly, "you had your little fun? But if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." Aunt Linda let out a sharp breath. "It's not just him, Ron. My card was declined twice. I just tried to book that hotel for your anniversary trip. It didn't go through. It's saying insufficient funds." Uncle Greg stood up and turned his phone toward me. "What is this?" he said. "This message says distribution, frozen by administrator." "Who's the administrator?" I didn't even blink. "I am." The words weren't loud, but they carried. They cut through the room like a knife, and I watched the realization settle across every face at the table. Mom stiffened beside Ron. "What do you mean you are?" I said slowly, folding my napkin and placing it gently beside my plate. "I'm the one who oversees the trust." Grandpa pointed me before he passed. "Remember? He what?" Jenna whispered. That was the moment it hit them. They didn't remember. Rather, they didn't care enough to. At the funeral, when emotions were high and everyone was scrambling to stake their claim, Grandpa's lawyer had given me a thick folder and a handshake. I'd kept everything quiet, managed it responsibly, made no waves. I didn't even take a fee, something they definitely would have thrown a fit over. But now they were suddenly very interested. Mom's voice trembled. "Adrian, you can't just shut off the trust. People rely on that money." I nodded. "I know. That's what makes it so interesting." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her. "Trevor, Mr. Big Corporate Job," scoffed. "This is seriously messed up. You think you're better than us because you've got handed a tech company?" "No," I replied. "I think I'm tired of subsidizing a group of people who mock me to my face while living off the thing they conveniently forget I manage." There it was, the truth. And I didn't raise my voice once. Ron slammed his fork down. "So this is what? Some kind of tantrum?" I laughed once, not out of amusement, out of disbelief. "You know what's funny? I never intended to do anything. I was perfectly happy to let you all keep living the way you've been living, but you couldn't help yourselves. You had to keep poking, keep belittling, and now you're confused because your little pet nerd decided not to roll over for once." Silence returned, this time heavier. No one reached for their phones again. Aunt Linda, still clutching hers like it might suddenly fix itself, leaned forward with a forced smile. "Adrian, sweetie, this is obviously a misunderstanding. You've always been so good with numbers. Maybe you can just fix whatever went wrong." Her voice was saccharine now. Sweet, syrupy manipulation, the same tone she used to use when she needed someone to help her reset the router, which always somehow turned into reorganizing her entire filing system. I met her eyes. You know what's interesting about trust funds, Aunt Linda? They're built on trust. And I'm starting to think maybe this family's fresh out of it. Trevor pushed his chair back loudly and stood. This is insane. You don't get to decide who's worthy of Grandpa's money. I tilted my head. You're right, but Grandpa did, Greg muttered under his breath. This is extortion. No, I replied. It's clarity. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't shrinking under the weight of their expectations or trying to prove I belonged. I just sat there, calm as still water, while their world tilted sideways. Then something unexpected happened. My cousin Sophie, quiet, polite, always sitting on the periphery of the family drama, spoke up. Actually, I think Adrian's got a point. Everyone turned to look at her. She looked a little startled herself, but continued anyway. He's always been the one to help Grandpa manage his accounts. He was there during the hospital visits. I remember because I was 2. And while the rest of us were busy planning brunches and spa days, he was sorting through medical bills and power of attorney paperwork. So maybe we should. I don't know. Stop pretending like this all came out of nowhere. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then my mom said quietly, but freezing, the whole trust. Don't you think that's going too far? I met her gaze again. Honestly, I think it's the first boundary I've ever drawn with this family, and I meant it. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and laughed at, I'd absorbed it all in silence. Now I had a voice. Now they were listening. And the weight of their dependency was finally visible. Not just to me, but to them. I could see it in their eyes, a cocktail of guilt, fear, and a slow dawning understanding that they had mistaken quiet for weak. And I hadn't even gotten to the best part yet. I let the silence linger, let it stretch until it became uncomfortable, until everyone at the table was fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, or glancing at their screens like the banking app might suddenly spring back to life if they stared hard enough. I wasn't in a hurry. Wanted them to sit with it, to actually feel the consequences for once, instead of brushing them off or pretending they didn't exist. And that's when I stood up, not to storm out or make a grand speech, just calmly. I slid my chair back, took one last sip from my glass of water, and gently tapped the screen of my phone again. The same banking interface opened. I didn't have to say a word, so watching me hold that phone was enough to set them all on edge. Where are you going? My mom asked. Just stepping outside for a bit, I said casually. Take a walk. Fresh air, you know. The kind of thing people with no real job have time for. It was a cheap jab, and I knew it. But I let it hang in the air as I tucked the phone in my pocket and strolled out the sliding glass doors onto the patio. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting a soft golden hue across Aunt Linda's perfectly manicured lawn. I stood there, hands in my pockets, breathing in the quiet. The absurdity of it all settled over me like fog. I hadn't planned to do this. Not tonight. Not ever, really. But it felt inevitable, like years of restraint had finally boiled over. Not in anger, but in calculation, precision. Behind me, the murmur of hushed conversation grew into panicked whispers. I could imagine them scrambling, checking balances, calling their banks, texting each other to confirm that yes, this was real. The trust account, their invisible safety net, was no longer accessible. And I hadn't even revoked access yet. I'd simply paused it. The real fun hadn't started. A few minutes passed before the patio door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. You always were a little dramatic, said my mother's voice, measured and cold. I exhaled, says the woman who just watched her entire family spiral because the money flow stopped for 5 minutes. She came to stand beside me, her arms crossed tight. She always did that when she felt cornered. You've made your point. But if you think this is going to earn you some kind of respect, I turned to face her. Respect? I gave up on that a long time ago. She blinked. I was never the golden child, never the one with the impressive internships or the picture-perfect wedding, or the conventional life path. And I was fine with that. But you, all of you, made sure to remind me at every opportunity that I was the odd one out, that my success didn't look like success to you, and the one thing that made it easier to swallow was knowing Grandpa saw me. My voice cracked a little there unexpectedly. He saw what you all refused to. And instead of telling you, he trusted me to show you. Her face shifted, that subtle flinch when the words hit deeper than expected. She opened her mouth to say something. Maybe a rebuttal, maybe an apology, maybe just more deflection. But the sound of the patio door sliding open again interrupted us. Trevor stepped out. His jaw was tight, and he looked like he hadn't quite decided if he was angry or scared. "Look," he said, "we get it. You're upset, but you don't have the right to punish everyone because you feel like an outsider." I didn't even bother responding directly. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapped a few times, and held it up toward him. A list of transactions, names, account IDs, payout schedules. Want to guess how much money you've personally withdrawn from the trust in the past 18 months? He narrowed his eyes. 27,000. I said you told everyone you had a scholarship, that you were saving up for your apartment, that you were being responsible. Meanwhile, you've been eating out every other night, leasing a car you can't afford, and using Grandpa's legacy like it was a bottomless wallet. Trevor flushed bright red. "That's none of your business." Actually, I interrupted. "It is because it's my job to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to go. And until now, let it slide." I told myself I was just the manager, not the judge. I lowered the phone, but maybe it's time to start asking some questions. He opened his mouth to protest, but then stopped, because he had nothing, because he knew. My mom looked between us, then back toward the house, where the low hum of more panicked conversations still echoed through the glass. "This will cause a rift," she said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded. Maybe it needs to, because I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I also wasn't going to keep enabling them. Not anymore. "Tell the family they can expect a full review of distributions over the next 2 weeks. Every withdrawal, every expense, every name." My mom stared at me like she'd never seen me before, and maybe she hadn't. Then I turned back toward the yard, hands in my pockets again. As the air cooled and the sky dimmed, behind me, the door creaked. Once more, then came the sound I hadn't expected. Aunt Linda's voice low, clipped angry, and she wasn't talking to me. She was on the phone. "I don't care who he is. I want access to that money now," she was saying. "Call the lawyer. Call someone. He can't just do this." I didn't turn. I didn't move, but I smiled because I knew what was coming next. I didn't go back inside right away. I let them squirm for a bit, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time they needed to feel it, the consequences, the fragility of the system they'd taken for granted, and the weight of what happens when you burn the person holding it together. I stood in the yard until the sun disappeared behind the trees, until the temperature dropped enough that I could see the condensation from my breath. It was peaceful. It was quiet, like the storm behind the glass doors. I could still faintly hear. Eventually, I went back inside. The room had shifted. The same people who had laughed at me earlier were now grouped in tight clusters, whispering, phones in hand. Some were making calls, others scrolling frantically through bank apps and email threads. Aunt Linda looked furious. Uncle Greg was on the phone with someone, likely their lawyer, pacing along the hallway with sweat beading along his brow. Jenna sat with her arms crossed, not saying a word, but watching everything. I walked back to my seat at the dining table, picked up the napkin I'd left behind, and calmly sat back down. No one said anything until Trevor, his ego still reeling, snapped. "You think this makes you the big man now? Playing puppet master while the rest of us suffer." Met his gaze not with anger, just exhaustion. "You really still don't get it?" "Do you?" I said. "This isn't about control. It's about accountability. For years, I've been managing this trust. Not just keeping it alive, but growing it. I turned Grandpa's investments into something self-sustaining. I kept you all afloat without complaint. Even while you laughed at me, mocked me, and dismissed everything I did." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. I didn't just pause the distributions tonight because you insulted me. That was just the last straw. I've been preparing for this moment for over a year. I placed the folder on the table and slid it forward. Inside our records, full audits, every payment, every dollar spent, color-coded, itemized with source receipts. I hired a private accountant 6 months ago to cross-check everything. They stared at it like it was radioactive. Some of you used the trust the way Grandpa intended. College, housing, health emergencies, no issues there, but others, my eye scan. The table had been treating it like a piggy bank. Luxury vacations, boutique shopping sprees. One of you even used it to buy crypt during the peak of the bubble. Uncle Ron looked away fast. I'm not here to punish anyone, I continued. Starting now. Mom spoke, voice brittle. And who gave you the right? I turned to her. Grandpa did. And in case you forgot, here's the signed legal document. I slid another paper across the table. His will, his signature, the part where it clearly stated that I was sole administrator with full discretionary power. Aunt Linda leaned over it. Squinting, her face turned pale. So I said, here's what's happening. The trust isn't being dissolved. It's being restructured. A full financial audit will be done over the next 30 days. Anyone found to have misused funds will be required to pay them back in full. Till then, all distributions are frozen. Uncle Greg looked like he was going to pop a blood vessel. You can't just... I can't. I cut in and I am. Sophie, still seated quietly in the corner, finally spoke again. He's right. Everyone turned. Sophie shrugged. You all laughed when he offered to help with Grandpa's paperwork. You called him the IT guy. You mocked him when he started that company. Used his systems and never said thank you. And now you're shocked that the one person who's been responsible all along finally stopped letting you take advantage of him. She glanced at me. I think it's about time. The tension in the room shifted slightly, but enough. Ron stood up abruptly. Come on, Linda, we don't need this. We've got our own money, which I knew wasn't entirely true, but sure, let him save face. He stormed out, Linda trailing behind him. Greg followed a minute later, still on the phone. Others began trickling out as well, some in silence, others with muttered goodbyes. A few offered awkward nods in my direction. No apologies, not yet. I didn't need them. I didn't expect them. Eventually, it was just me, Mom, and Sophie. Mom looked like she wanted to say something, her mouth open, then closed again. Instead, she just stood and walked over to me. I didn't know, she said finally. I know, I replied. You could have told me, I smiled faintly. Would you have listened? She hesitated, then shook her head. I didn't think so. She reached out, touched my shoulder lightly, and whispered, He really did trust you, didn't he? Yeah, I said. He did. She nodded and left. Sophie lingered. I meant what I said, she offered. If you ever need help going through the records or setting up a new distribution model, I'd be happy to assist. I looked at her, surprised. Really? She smiled. You're not the only one who's tired of being ignored. I nodded, then stood and gathered my things. As I left the house and stepped into the cool night, I felt light. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of being the family doormat. I wasn't the punchline anymore. I was the line they never saw coming. And they would remember this dinner. Not for the roast or the wine or the awkward conversations, but for the moment the balance of power shifted permanently. Because the truth is, sometimes the quiet ones are only quiet because they're busy watching, building, preparing. When they finally speak, they don't raise their voice, just change everything.